just get, first of all, get your latest appraisal on the state of the war.
Well, I think the momentum is still with the Ukrainians, and the Russians seek to blunt that, both in the diplomatic domain. That's why you've got these sort of faux talks about negotiations with Musk, because they are losing on the battlefield, and no rhetoric can stop that reality at the moment. I think we also have to be careful about how we interpret some new approach from the Russians. So if you look at the Kersch Bridge attack by the Ukrainians, that is a legitimate deep battle attack to prevent the logistic flow of Russian material. That's fine. What is not fine from the Russian response is this sort of pattern of previous targeting that we've seen, which is missile terrorism. What is fine from the Russian side, or at least legitimate in just war terms, is to go after critical national infrastructure of the Ukrainians to try and break the will of the Ukrainians. What is not legitimate and proportionate, and is not distinction between civil and military targets, is to go after sort of schools and residential blocks and city parks and things like that.
Yes.
I also don't think that the arrival of General Surovikin as the new commander taking over from General Vornikov will make any difference whatsoever.
Yes.
Both of them really were butchers of Syria. So unless you've got a new operational design from the Russians, then it's merely rinse and repeat. And what I think we've seen in the last 5 days is more rinse and repeat.
That's interesting. I want to come on maybe in a moment to the arrival of General Surovikin, the Russian commander, and if that's not going to make any difference, I just wonder why that is, just to explain that, because it is genuinely interesting. And looking at the conflict since the annexation of those Ukrainian territories and the blowing up of the Crimea Bridge, what's your assessment, if it's possible to reach one, Chip, on the capacity of Ukraine and of the Russian enemy to maintain this level of conflict with this intensity, given the resources at their disposal?
Well, the key thing is that one side has quite a large sugar daddy and the other side does not. So as long as the international community keeps supporting Ukraine with humanitarian, military, and economic aid, because, for example, the GDP of Ukraine has gone down 30% in the last 9 months. So as long as that remains robust, and as long as Russia keeps going into its stocks, which are diminishing severely, as we saw from Jeremy Fleming's talk this week, then the momentum and the balance of power will go towards the Ukrainians. Now, again, as we've said before, I think then it's really Putin taking a gamble on the winter clock to blunt the offensive power of the Ukrainians, because the same tempo of operations can't be sustained in the winter. And secondly, that will lead to potentially the spring gamble when he thinks that the West will tire of supporting Ukraine. But there's no such thing really as the unified West in lots of ways. There's mini West. So, for example, the notion that the Baltics and Poland are going to stop supporting Ukraine when they've been occupied before, and they've given a third of their military capability essentially to the Ukrainians, they are just not going to stop, because countries like that understand what Russia is like. People who are in Western Europe, Germany, UK, maybe France, don't necessarily always understand the nature of the beast in the way that those who have been part of the old Soviet Union do.
Indeed. I mean, we're talking about winter there. Over and over again, we talk about the transformative effects of winter arriving on the battlefield. Just explain to we military laymen about, are we purely talking about the ground becoming impassable and heavy armour and heavy vehicles simply being unable to be as mobile as it was before?
Well, partly it depends on the temperature. So there is obviously a freezing point where lubricants and weapon systems don't work. That's actually quite low. You need to get sort of 20 minus 30, 40, something like that. But of course, the human body is degraded in severe environmental conditions, as for example we saw with the ability of the Argentinians to sustain themselves in the Falklands War. So having the material of war, and as much in this sense, it's the boots and beans to make sure that you can survive and then flourish and fight. Because rather like Hitler found out and Napoleon before him. General January and General February can be mighty foes in that
Yeah.
part of the world.
And does that mean that battle lines are then frozen, as it were? You get a, I don't know, what would you describe it as? A sort of a, not quite a cessation of hostilities, but a very great slow down of hostilities enforced just by the weather.
They can be. It depends if you can have a localized breakthrough, which you can achieve potentially by reconnaissance pull to then do these encirclement operations, which the Ukrainians have been very, very good at doing. So if you look at three of the principles of war, which we haven't really looked at recently. So, for example, maintenance of the aim is a crucial one, but the second one is maintenance of morale. If you have got an ad hoc force, which at the moment we are seeing from the Russians, whereas, for example, 10,000 troops have now just been finished training in the UK from Ukraine and are going back to Ukraine from the UK now to take part in operations. So you have a potentially an asymmetry of equipped forces and therefore their ability to fight and fight effectively.
Okay, and just a word about the new Russian commander on the scene, General Surovikin, who has, as you say, the nickname of being the Butcher of Syria. Enormous, appalling attacks on on civilian targets in Syria, but of course in Syria the Russians were not faced with strong air defences, and that's a big difference.
It is indeed, and as I said earlier on, unless you've got a new operational design from the Russians, then there's not a lot which is new of having a commander. You can more efficiently be a brute, which is really what we're seeing with this missile terrorism at the moment. But I don't see there's a new operational design. Now, what we are sort of seeing, one of the things, of course, is this sort of notion of a feint with troops in Belarus that I don't think will come to anything in terms of an assault from the Belarusian front, but it actually fixes forces. That means it keeps Ukrainian forces occupied there, which means they can't be used elsewhere. So that makes sense from the perspective of Surovikin. But unless you can get maneuver forces to operate on the battlefield, then he's really the gamble really is the political gamble and the strategy bridge between politics and war, and that is that what Putin has, he will seek to hold, and the rest of it he will seek to negotiate. That is, what's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable, and that's the way I think he's trying to frame it for the future come sort of spring next year, unless the Russians collapse. There can still be localized collapses, which I think we will still see. And I've used that term before about kettling and crushing in Kherson. I still think that will come before the end of this year.